March 17, 1945. The sky over rural Poland screamed with the sound of dying engines. Lieutenant David Walsh, navigator aboard a B-24 Liberator, felt the aircraft shudder violently as flak tore through the fuselage. The bomber, part of the 15th Air Force's relentless campaign against German oil refineries, had been hit hard over Silesia. Now, spinning toward Earth, Walsh knew his war was about to take a turn he'd never trained for. Through the chaos of wind and fire, he pulled the ripcord. His parachute deployed with a violent jerk, and suddenly the world went silent except for the rush of air. Below him, the patchwork fields of occupied Poland spread out like a death sentence. He was coming down in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. The Third Reich was collapsing, and desperate men did desperate things. SS units, retreating westward from the advancing Red Army, were executing anyone who might slow them down. Allied airmen topped that list. Walsh had heard the stories in briefings. Downed flyers found hanging from trees, bodies left as warnings. As his boots hit the frozen ground and he scrambled to gather his chute, Walsh's mind raced through his options. None of them were good. He was deep in enemy territory, miles from any partisan contact he knew of, and the sound of distant artillery told him the Eastern Front was close but not close enough. He buried his parachute in a half-frozen ditch and started moving, keeping low, heading toward a cluster of farm buildings in the distance. His survival training kicked in. Find shelter, find food, evade capture. But as he stumbled across a muddy field, his leather flight jacket marking him as obviously American, Walsh understood the brutal mathematics of his situation. In March 1945, Poland was a killing ground. The Germans were retreating but still deadly. The Soviets were advancing but treated everyone with suspicion. And the Polish people caught between these grinding forces had already suffered beyond measure. Why would any of them risk their lives for a stranger who'd fallen from the sky? The farmhouse appeared through the morning mist. Small, weathered, its thatched roof sagging. Smoke rose from the chimney. Walsh crouched behind a bare tree, watching. He saw movement. A woman, thin, wearing a dark headscarf, emerged to draw water from a well. She moved with the exhausted efficiency of someone who'd learned to survive on the edge of catastrophe. Walsh made a decision that would define the next 11 weeks of his life. He stood up and walked toward her, hands raised. The woman froze when she saw him. Her eyes went wide, and Walsh saw her glance quickly toward the road, then back to him. She was calculating the same terrible math he'd been running through his head. Then she did something that shocked him. She grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the house. No words, just urgent, desperate motion. Maria Kowalski was 34 years old, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. She was a widow with 2 young sons, trying to survive in a landscape where survival itself was an act of defiance. As she shoved Walsh through her door and into the dim interior of her home, she was making a choice that could get her entire family killed. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, hidden beneath a worn rug and a heavy wooden table. Maria moved the furniture with practiced speed, lifted the door and pointed down. Walsh understood immediately. He climbed down into darkness. The cellar was perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a dirt floor and walls lined with rough wooden shelves. The ceiling was so low Walsh couldn't stand fully upright. Preserved vegetables in clay jars lined the shelves, potatoes, beets, cabbage. The smell of earth and fermentation filled the small space. Above him, he heard the trapdoor close. Then the scrape of furniture being moved back into place. Then footsteps. Then voices, children's voices. Maria's sons, he would learn, were 7 and 9 years old. They were laughing about something, the sound muffled but clear through the floorboards. Walsh stood in the darkness, his heart pounding, and realized he was literally beneath a family's life. Every sound from above became his world. The creak of chairs, the clatter of dishes, the boys arguing over some toy. Maria's voice, firm but loving, telling them to wash their hands, to finish their bread, to stop fighting. Walsh learned the rhythms of the household through sound alone. He learned when they woke, when they ate, when they slept. He learned that the boys had school some days, taught by an elderly woman in the village. He learned that German patrols came through irregularly, their boots heavy on the road outside. The first time Walsh heard German voices in the house itself, he thought his heart would stop. Soldiers had entered, demanding food. Maria's voice remained calm, offering what little she had. Walsh could hear them moving around directly above him, their weight making the floorboards creak. One of them seemed to be standing right on the trapdoor. Walsh held his breath until his lungs burned. The soldiers left, but they came back. Over the weeks that followed, German patrols would return again and again, sometimes just passing through, sometimes searching for deserters or partisans. Each time, Walsh pressed himself against the earthen wall of the cellar and waited to be discovered. Each time, Maria calmly dealt with men who had the power to kill her and her children without consequence. At night, after the boys were asleep, Maria would move the table and open the trapdoor just enough to pass down food. A bowl of thin soup, a piece of dark bread, sometimes just a few potatoes. Walsh understood she was giving him food her own children needed. The guilt of that weighed on him almost as much as the fear. On the third night, Maria whispered down to him in broken German, the only language they might share. Walsh's German was minimal, learned from intelligence briefings, but he tried. The conversation was halting, difficult. Maria wanted to know his name, where he was from. Walsh told her. Nebraska. A farm like hers, though he didn't know the German word for the vast American plains. Maria seemed to understand the concept of farm, at least. She asked if he had family. Walsh told her about his parents, his younger sister. He asked about her husband. The silence that followed was long enough that Walsh thought she'd left. Then she said one word, "Tot, dead." Walsh knew that word. He said he was sorry. Another long silence. Then Maria closed the trapdoor. As days turned into weeks, their nighttime conversations became more elaborate. Maria began teaching Walsh Polish words. Simple things at first. Chleb, bread. Woda, water. Dzień dobry, good day. Walsh repeated them back, his American accent mangling the unfamiliar sounds, and he could hear Maria's quiet laugh through the floorboards. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. The language lessons became a lifeline for both of them. For Walsh, learning Polish gave him something to focus on besides the crushing claustrophobia and fear. For Maria, teaching him seemed to provide a brief escape from the grinding terror of her daily existence. She would whisper phrases through the gap in the trapdoor, and Walsh would repeat them. Jaksai Mass, how are you? DZQ, thank you. PR Zeprasam, I'm sorry. Through these whispered lessons, Walsh began to understand more of what he heard during the day. The boys' names were Peter and Janus. They talked about their father sometimes, always in past tense, always with a sadness that carried even through the language barrier. They talked about being hungry. They talked about the soldiers. They talked about when the war would end. Walsh learned to recognize the sound of danger, the heavy truck engines that meant German military vehicles, the sharper, more urgent voices that meant SS rather than regular Wehrmacht. The sudden silence from above that meant Maria had heard something that frightened her. One afternoon in early April, Walsh heard a commotion outside, shouting in German, the boys crying, Maria's voice raised in protest. Walsh pressed his ear to the floorboards, his body tense. German soldiers were searching the property. He could hear them in the house, throwing things around. One of them was yelling about partisans, about weapons, about traitors. Maria was insisting she had nothing, knew nothing. She was just a widow trying to feed her children. The search seemed to last forever. Walsh heard boots directly above him, heard furniture being moved. He realized with cold terror that they were being thorough. If they moved the table, if they lifted the rug, if they saw the trapdoor, it was over. Not just for him, for all of them. Then he heard one of the boys scream. Not a cry of pain, but of fear. A soldier had grabbed him, was threatening him, trying to force Maria to admit she was hiding something. Walsh's hand went to the small knife he'd kept from his survival kit. It was a pathetic weapon against armed soldiers, but if they opened that trapdoor, he wouldn't go quietly. He wouldn't let them take Maria and her boys without a fight. Maria's voice cut through the chaos. She was begging, pleading. Walsh didn't need to understand every word to grasp her meaning. She was offering them everything she had, food, the few valuables she'd hidden, anything. Just leave her children alone. There was a long moment of tense silence. Then the soldier released the boy. More German words, harsh and mocking, then boots heading toward the door, then truck engines starting, then silence. Walsh waited in the darkness, every muscle locked tight. Finally the trapdoor opened a crack. Maria's face appeared, pale and drawn. She looked down at him and said nothing. She didn't need to. Walsh saw in her eyes what had just been risked, what was being risked every single day. That night she didn't come to talk. Walsh lay on the dirt floor, listening to her comfort her crying children above, and felt the full weight of his presence in this house. He was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. Every day he stayed was another day this family stood on the edge of execution, but there was nowhere else to go. The front lines were fluid, chaotic. German and Soviet forces were clashing across Poland. Retreating Wehrmacht units were increasingly desperate and brutal, and Walsh had no way of knowing who controlled what territory or how to reach Allied lines. He was trapped in that cellar as surely as if he'd been in a German POW camp. Except here, his captivity was voluntary, and his jailer was risking everything to keep him alive. As April progressed, the sound of artillery grew louder. The Eastern Front was moving closer. Walsh could hear it day and night now, a distant thunder that never quite stopped. The Soviet advance was pushing the Germans back, and this small Polish village was about to become a battlefield. The German patrols became less frequent but more vicious. Walsh heard stories through Maria's whispered translations. Villages burned, people shot for no reason beyond being in the wrong place. The SS was destroying everything as they retreated, leaving scorched earth for the Soviets. Maria told him that some villagers had fled, others had hidden in the forests. She had stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because moving two young boys across an active war zone seemed more dangerous than staying put. And Walsh understood, though she never said it directly, because she had an American airman hidden in her cellar who couldn't be moved. In late April, the artillery became so loud that Walsh could feel it through the earth around him. Shells were landing close enough to shake dust from the cellar ceiling. Above him, he heard Maria gathering her boys, heard her voice trying to stay calm while telling them to stay away from the windows. One night, the bombardment was so intense that Maria opened the trapdoor and brought the boys down into the cellar with Walsh. It was the first time he'd seen them. Peter and Jana stared at him with wide eyes, terrified not just of the explosions outside, but of the strange man in their cellar. Walsh tried to smile, tried to look non-threatening. He said the few Polish words he knew. Dzień dobry, jak się masz. The boys pressed against their mother. Maria spoke to them quietly, explaining who Walsh was, an American, a pilot. A friend, not a danger. The word she used, Walsh would later learn, was przyjaciel, friend. They spent that night huddled together in the cellar while the world exploded above them. Walsh found himself telling the boys stories, translated haltingly through Maria. Stories about America, about farms in Nebraska, about his sister's dog, anything to distract them from the terror. Somewhere in those dark hours, with the earth shaking and the children crying, Walsh understood something profound. Maria hadn't just been hiding him, she'd been protecting him. Not as a strategic asset or a political statement, but as a human being. The same way she protected her own children. When morning came and the bombardment had moved on, Maria took the boys back upstairs. But something had changed. The secret was shared now. The boys knew, and in knowing, they became part of the conspiracy of survival. Over the next week, Walsh occasionally heard them whisper about the American in the cellar. They seemed to have accepted his presence, even to be excited by it in the way children can find adventure in terrible circumstances. Then, on May 8, 1945, the sounds of war changed. The artillery stopped. The German vehicles disappeared, and new sounds emerged. Different engines, different voices, Russian voices. The Red Army had arrived. Walsh heard Soviet soldiers in the village, heard them going house to house. He heard Maria speaking to them in Polish, heard the rough responses in Russian. The two languages were similar enough that communication was possible, if difficult. For hours, Walsh waited in the cellar, uncertain. The Germans were gone, but the Soviets weren't exactly allies. They were suspicious of everyone, especially Americans. There were stories of American airmen being detained by Soviet forces, held for weeks or months in uncertain conditions. Maria finally opened the trapdoor that evening. She looked exhausted, drained. She told Walsh in their mixed language of Polish, German, and gesture that it was safe. The Germans were gone. The Soviets controlled the village. He could come out. Walsh climbed out of the cellar for the first time in 11 weeks. His legs barely held him. The kitchen looked different than he'd imagined it from the sounds. Smaller, poorer, more worn. Maria watched him stand, watched him look around at the world he'd only heard. Then she told him something that made him sit back down. Through halting words and painful gestures, Maria explained about her husband. His name had been Thomas. He'd been a teacher before the war. When the Germans came, when the occupation began, when the persecution of Jews intensified, Thomas had made a choice. He'd hidden people. Jewish families from the village and from nearby towns. He'd hidden them in the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. The same cellar where Walsh had just spent 11 weeks. For months, Thomas and Maria had sheltered refugees, moving them along underground networks toward hoped-for safety. They'd risked everything, and eventually someone had betrayed them. The Gestapo had come in 1943. They'd found evidence, though the refugees themselves had already been moved. They'd arrested Thomas. Maria never saw him again. She learned later that he'd been executed. Shot in the prison yard in the nearby town. The cellar had been empty since then, until an American airman fell from the sky. Walsh stood in that kitchen, looking at this woman who'd lost her husband for hiding people, and who'd then turned around and hidden him in the same place, risking the same fate. He asked her why. Why would she take that risk again, knowing what it had cost her? Maria's answer was simple: because Thomas would have wanted her to. Because hiding people who needed help was what good people did. Because the alternative was to let the cruelty win. Walsh had no words. In any language. He stood there, this American farm boy turned airman, looking at a Polish widow who'd shown more courage in 11 weeks than he'd shown in his entire life. The Soviet authorities were initially suspicious of Walsh's story, but his uniform, his dog tags, and his obvious American accent eventually convinced them. They arranged for him to be transported west, through the chaotic landscape of defeated Germany, eventually reaching American lines in early June. Before he left, Walsh tried to thank Maria. He had nothing to give her, no money, no valuables, nothing but words that felt desperately inadequate. He promised to write. He promised to send help. He promised to tell people what she'd done. Maria simply nodded. She seemed almost embarrassed by his gratitude. This was just what one did, her expression seemed to say. This was just being human. Walsh watched her village disappear as the Soviet truck carried him away. He watched the small farmhouse fade into the distance. He thought about the root cellar beneath that kitchen floor, about the people who'd hidden there before him, about Thomas, who died for his courage, about Maria, who'd continued his work despite the cost. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The killing had stopped. But Walsh understood that the real battles had been fought in places like that farmhouse, by people like Maria, people who'd chosen mercy when cruelty was easier, who'd chosen risk when safety was available, who'd chosen to remain human when the world had gone insane. Walsh returned to Nebraska in July 1945. He tried to resume his normal life. He tried to explain to people what had happened to him. But how do you explain 11 weeks in a cellar to people who'd experienced the war through newsreels and radio broadcasts? How do you convey the weight of hearing children play above you while German soldiers searched for you? How do you describe the courage of a woman who'd already lost everything and chose to risk what little remained? He wrote letters to Maria. The first few came back undelivered. The chaos of post-war Poland made communication nearly impossible. Soviet occupation brought new restrictions, new dangers. Walsh kept trying. In 1947, he finally received a response. A brief letter, written in careful Polish that Walsh had to have translated. Maria and her boys were alive. They were surviving. The farm was still there. She thanked him for remembering them. Walsh sent packages, food, clothing, money when he could. It was never enough. It could never be enough. But he sent what he could, and he kept writing. Over the years, as Poland disappeared behind the Iron Curtain, communication became more difficult. Letters took months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Walsh married, had children of his own, built a life in Nebraska. But he never forgot the 11 weeks beneath Maria's kitchen floor. He never forgot the sound of children playing above him, unaware of the American beneath their feet. He never forgot the whispered Polish lessons in the darkness. He never forgot the woman who'd chosen to hide him in the same place her husband had been killed for hiding others. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Iron Curtain began to lift, Walsh was 68 years old. One of his first acts was to book a flight to Poland. He had to find Maria, had to see her again, had to tell her face to face what her courage had meant. The village had changed, modernized in the way communist Poland had modernized. But the farmhouse was still there, smaller and more worn than he remembered. An elderly woman answered his knock. Walsh recognized her immediately, though 44 years had passed. Maria recognized him too. They stood in the doorway, two old people who'd shared 11 weeks of whispered conversations through a cellar door, and they wept. Maria's sons were grown, with families of their own. Peter had become an engineer. Janis taught history. They remembered the American in the cellar, remembered the night of the bombardment when he told them stories. They remembered their mother's courage. Walsh spent a week in Poland, meeting Maria's family, seeing the root cellar again, walking the fields where he'd hidden his parachute in 1945. He tried again to thank Maria, to express what she'd done for him. Maria, now 78 years old, gave him the same look she'd given him in 1945. This was just what one did. This was just being human. Walsh returned to Nebraska with a deeper understanding of what he'd experienced. It wasn't just a story of survival or evasion. It was a story about the choices people make when everything is at stake. About the courage required to remain decent in indecent times. About a woman who'd lost her husband for hiding people and then turned around and hid another person in the same place, because that's who she was. That's who Thomas had been. That's who they'd chosen to remain, even when the cost was almost unbearable. David Walsh died in 2003 at the age of 82. In his later years, he'd spoken frequently about his experience, giving talks at schools and veterans organizations. He always emphasized the same point. The real heroes of World War II weren't the soldiers or the airmen or the generals. They were people like Maria Kowalski, people who'd had every reason to look away to protect themselves, to choose safety over mercy, and who'd chosen mercy anyway. Maria died in 1995 at the age of 84. She never sought recognition for what she'd done, never applied for any of the honors or awards given to those who'd hidden people during the war. When asked about it in her later years, she always said the same thing. She'd done what Thomas would have wanted. She'd done what any decent person would do. She'd simply tried to remain human. The root cellar still exists. The farmhouse is now owned by Maria's grandson, Peter's son. He's turned part of it into a small museum, documenting his grandmother's story and his grandfather's sacrifice. The cellar has been preserved as it was. The same earthen walls, the same low ceiling, the same shelves where preserved vegetables once sat. Visitors can climb down into that small space and try to imagine spending 11 weeks there. Try to imagine hearing footsteps above, hearing German soldiers searching, hearing children playing, unaware of the secret beneath their feet. Try to imagine the courage required to hide someone there, knowing what had happened to the last person who'd done so. The story of David Walsh and Maria Kowalski is not unique. Across occupied Europe, countless people made similar choices. Hid Allied airmen, sheltered refugees, risked everything to help strangers. Many of them paid with their lives. Many of them were never recognized or remembered, but their actions represented something essential about human nature: the capacity for courage, the capacity for mercy, the capacity to choose decency when cruelty was easier. In March 1945, a B-24 Navigator fell from the sky into occupied Poland. He expected execution. He expected brutality. He expected the worst that war could offer. Instead, he found a widow who'd already lost everything and chose to risk what little remained. He found children who kept a secret that could have killed them. He found humanity in the darkest possible place. And for 11 weeks, through whispered conversations and shared hunger and constant terror, he learned what courage really looked like. It looked like a woman moving a table to pass down a bowl of soup. It looked like children playing quietly so the soldiers outside wouldn't investigate. It looked like choosing to hide someone in a cellar that had already cost you everything. That's the story David Walsh carried with him for the rest of his life. Not a story of his own survival, but a story of Maria's courage. A story of ordinary people making extraordinary choices. A story of humanity persisting in the face of inhumanity. The war ended 79 years ago. The veterans are nearly all gone now. The witnesses are fading, but stories like this one remain. They remain because they tell us something essential about who we are and who we can choose to be. They remain because they remind us that even in the darkest times, even when everything is at stake, some people choose mercy. Some people choose courage. Some people choose to remain human. Maria Kowalski chose to hide an American airman in the same cellar where her husband had hidden Jewish refugees, the same cellar that had cost Thomas his life. She made that choice knowing the risk, knowing the cost, knowing what she was gambling, and she made it anyway, because that's what decent people do, that's what Thomas would have wanted, that's what being human required. Lieutenant David Walsh fell from the sky in March 1945 expecting to die. Instead, he learned what it meant to truly live. He learned it from a Polish widow and her 2 young sons. He learned it in a root cellar beneath a kitchen floor. He learned it through 11 weeks of whispered Polish lessons and shared hunger and constant fear. He learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to do what's right despite the fear. It's the choice to help when helping could kill you. It's the choice to remain human when the world has gone insane. That's the lesson David Walsh carried from that cellar. That's the lesson he spent the rest of his life trying to share. And that's the lesson we carry forward, remembering Maria and Thomas Kowalski, remembering all those who made similar choices, remembering that even in the darkest times, humanity persists. It persists in small farmhouses in occupied Poland. It persists in root cellars beneath kitchen floors. It persists in the whispered conversations between a widow and an airman who fell from the sky. It persists in the choice to hide someone, to feed someone, to protect someone, even when doing so could cost you everything. That persistence, that choice, that courage is what ultimately defeated the darkness. Not armies or bombers or grand strategies, but individual people making individual choices to remain decent. People like Maria Kowalski, who lost her husband for hiding refugees and then turned around and hid an American airman in the same place. Because that's who she was, because that's what being human required, because some choices transcend fear and survival and self-preservation. Some choices define who we are. And in March 1945, in a small village in rural Poland, a widow made that choice. She made it for 11 weeks. She made it every day. She made it every time she moved that table and opened that trapdoor and passed down a bowl of soup. She made it every time German soldiers searched her house, and she kept her face calm and her voice steady. She made it every time her children asked why they were hungry, and she told them everything would be all right. She made that choice. And in doing so, she saved a life. She honored her husband's memory. She remained human in an inhuman time. That's the story of Lieutenant David Walsh and Maria Kowalski. That's the story of 11 weeks beneath a kitchen floor. That's the story of courage and mercy and humanity persisting in the darkest possible place. And that's a story worth remembering.